63. And it was written by Dr. S.I. Macmillan, and then his son-in-law has helped him with several revisions. So caught my attention because I'm going to skip through this. This we're not covering today is kind of a teaser to decide if you want to hear more of this medical stuff. And what we are going to get into today, we're going to start back in the time of Moses. And I looked at a couple of dates because I'm talking about a lot of history. Job, we think, was around 2100 BC. Abraham, 2166 to 1991 BC. Joseph was sold into Egypt, 1898, and he died 1805. And then Moses came along 1527. 40 years later, he was fled to Midian, and then 40 years after that, he was commissioned to lead the people out of Egypt. And you know the rest of the story. The 10 plagues started around 1446, which is when the first Passover happened. So, just a few dates to make it more like a history talk. So, the Ebers Papyrus, 1500 BC, kind of gives us a picture of the medicine in ancient Egypt at the time of Moses. The treatments in that were either useless or dangerous, and they included an amazing array of ingredients such as statue dust, beetle shells, mouse tails, cat hair, pig eyes, dog toes, breast milk, human semen, eel eyes, and goose guts. At least they were 100% natural.
Yummy. Wow.
Egyptian doctors were so smart that they applied to splinters worm blood and donkey dung. Of course, donkey dung is loaded with tetanus spores, so a simple splinter often resulted in a gruesome death from lockjaw. And you get the point. There's quite a few things that were done in that day that were.
You hope there wasn't a doctor around.
Do what?
You hope there wasn't a doctor around. They were.
The Egyptian doctors were, more like curanderos, just medicine men. I guess burning feathers, whatever. Until the late 1800s, we're going to spend a good bit of time in the 19th century, the 1800s today, but until the late 1800s, most doctors thought that pus promoted healing, so they intentionally infected wounds, killing millions. After 3,500 years, the doctrine of good and laudable pus has only recently faded. Good and laudable pus is kind of it's med school history. So here comes Moses. He's raised in the royal court of Egypt, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And with that education, who would expect Moses to make any breakthroughs in epidemic prevention? He recorded an unlikely promise to the ancient Hebrews in Exodus 15:26. If you give careful attention to the voice of the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So that's the title of the book, None of These Diseases. And come on. Maybe.
Is there a mouse in the house?
I saw it.
It was working until that very moment.
Just hit enter.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna have to do. And I had to find enter to hit it.
To the space bar.
Or the arrow button.
There you go.
Yeah, space bar is easier.
Okay, I'll be space cadet today. All right. So God gave Moses many health rules, filling whole sections of the Torah, and Moses had enough faith to record the divine innovations which contradicted his royal Egyptian training and none of the medical misconceptions. So you don't find any of that Egyptian nonsense in what Moses wrote. Finally, when doctors read and tried these guidelines, they quickly discovered how to prevent the spread of epidemics. So Moses was truly the father of modern infection control.
Awesome.
So leprosy was the AIDS of the Dark Ages. It killed millions for centuries. It was a slow, mutilating death. It's caused by the bacterium, Mycobacterium leprae, and spread by nasal and oral secretions from untreated patients. Of course, no one was treated until some modern antibiotics. Early signs would be patches of skin that were lighter, darker, redder, and would have a loss of sensation. It's now easily treated with antibiotics. It requires prolonged close contact with a contagious person to acquire it, and only a few weeks of medication now renders the patients not contagious. In the past, with no treatment, the person would have deforming, mutilating wounds due to infection and loss of sensation. We've seen Ben-Hur and all these other old Hollywood movies depicting leprosy. It was not pretty. Unhealing ulcers and loss of digits were common. So doctors had nothing to offer. Not only did they often make things worse, but they didn't have any real cure. And so the church in the Dark Ages took the leadership and looked back to the writings of Moses and said, hey, why don't we try this? You can put the Egyptians' cures to rest because you look at their mummies and they're just riddled with diseases. So we know that their doctors were not successful. In Leviticus 13:46, and I'm going to get you all to read some of these just so you won't have to listen to me read all of them. Leviticus 13:46, it's on the screen. The very first mention of quarantine. Somebody read that for me.
He will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp.
So that doesn't sound like rocket science, but that was actually what began to control leprosy. People had to segregate themselves away from everyone else. That's still not going to work. Okay. Leviticus chapter 13 details how the priest could distinguish the leprosy from other skin diseases. The priest was the dermatologist of the day and the doctor in many ways. And after all, he had the best textbook, right? So he had to distinguish who had something that was made him unclean and who was really going to be okay. So there was a 14-day isolation and observation time. If the hair in the sore had turned white and the sore appeared deeper than the skin, it's a serious skin disease and the person is unclean. If the skin area is white and not deep and the hair is not turned white, there's a 14-day quarantine. And after 14 days, if it's not spreading or if it's resolving, that person is clean. So the priest was looking at a lot of skin. Okay, he was a busy guy. What do you think? If they're declared unclean, then they're essentially quarantined from the rest of the camp until they're declared healed and clean. In Leviticus 13, someone read this 45 through 46.
The person who has a case of serious skin disease is to have his clothes torn and his hair hanging loose, and he must cover his mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as he has the disease, he is unclean. You must live alone in a place outside the camp.
So that's not just Hollywood. The unkempt hair and the torn clothes, that was part of God's prescription so that people would immediately go, okay, keep your distance from that person.
I also noticed it said cover his mouth, because
They
you
would
said
do
that,
this.
that it could be spread by oral.
Oral and nasal secretions.
Right.
Right. So if his disease disappears, and I honestly don't know how often that happened. I know in Jesus' day there was actually miraculous healing, but if it disappeared, then the priest's job would be to go outside the camp to examine him, and if he appeared to be clean, Then they would sacrifice a clean live bird, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. You're gonna see some of these come up in significance later. We won't read the details in Leviticus 14. And then another live bird was dipped in the blood of the sacrifice bird and released over open country. Kind of sounds like the goat that was released.
Scapegoat.
The scapegoat. Yeah.
It's a
So we got a
scapegoat.
scape bird. So the person being cleansed would wash his clothes, shave off all of his hair, including his eyebrows, bathe with water. He could enter the camp, but he had to remain outside of his tent for 7 days. We're going to talk about how you cleanse a tent that had someone die in it. We're going to talk about that. So anyway, they said, okay, just stay out of your tent for a week. And on the 7th day, he would shave all his hair again and bathe, and then he was declared clean. On the 8th day, he would make sacrifices detailed in Leviticus 14. It's a long passage. We're not going to read that. But they included a guilt offering of 1 male lamb with olive oil. It's called a presentation offering. Then there's a sin offering, a burnt offering, a grain offering. They did all of these things, which imagine if you got healed from leprosy, you were more than happy to make those offerings.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be a great study to look at all these offerings. And I think maybe you looked at the feast.
Yeah.
But has anyone done a study of all the different offerings?
No,
Okay.
not that I'm aware of.
I don't know if it would be as exciting as this talk.
It couldn't possibly.
So in the early 1800s, bringing it a little more in modern time, Norway had an epidemic of leprosy. The medical doctors could not slow it down, go figure. But the church instituted biblical rules of quarantine, and the epidemic slowed dramatically. But then people stopped being fearful, and precautions were relaxed, and the epidemic flared up. So 1873, Dr. Armauer Hansen found tiny red dots on a microscope slide from a patient and determined the cause of leprosy, now called Hansen's disease. The Norwegian government took action, passed the Norway Leprosy Act, began quarantine, and in less than 60 years, the cases fell from 58 to 69. So, and they didn't have any medical treatment, all they did was isolate. So that's significant. One of my favorite characters, in May of 1846, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. He was an obstetrician in a Vienna hospital, and he noticed a high percentage of women developed labor fever after delivering their babies and died. The autopsies of these women were done each morning by the medical students and attending physicians before they examined the living women in labor.
Wow.
With bare hands, they did the autopsies, maybe washed the blood off, and then went to the OB wards. And Semmelweis was observant. I know, ladies, you're cringing. Make sure your doctor washes good, puts on gloves. Dr. Semmelweis noted that women who had more internal exams were more likely to die, and if a doctor delivered her baby, the woman's death rate was 18%, and if a midwife did the delivery, only 3% died.
Telling the doctor to stay away.
Semmelweis was one of the few that noticed this, he started putting this together.
That's a pro for home birth.
Yeah, man.
Okay, if we have time at the end, we can talk about it. Asking the pediatrician how he feels about home birth. It's great until it's not.
Yeah.
Okay? Let's just put it that way. I've seen the aftermath of some of it was not. So, I'm not saying don't do it.
But you're saying don't do it.
No, I'm saying have some resources. Maybe head knowledge, maybe some other resources. Then a doctor who worked there had an inflamed cut on his finger. After doing an autopsy, he died with sepsis and widespread abscesses in his body. Semmelweis was taking note of all this. So he began to think, well, maybe the doctors and students were transferring some agent from the dead to the living. They still didn't know about bacteria. He required hand washing with a heavily chlorinated water after autopsies, and the death rate plummeted from 18% to 1% in 3 months. So
Might be honest.
you would think everybody would go, wow, great discovery, Semmelweis. They were really ticked off about all the hand washing. Then, if we have time, I'll give you some more hand washing stories. Anyway, so one day, we're down to 1% fatality rate, pretty good. One day the doctors examined a row of 12 women and 11 caught labor fever and died. So he started thinking, okay, we're transferring some agent from one living patient to the next and the next. And so he began to force these resistant doctors to wash after every internal exam. That's common sense to us, but in that day, it was an outrage. So the death rate fell even further, but the doctors' protest increased. So Semmelweis was demoted, eventually fired. His colleagues removed the washing basins and the death rate shot up again, and they didn't care. They were happy because they got rid of the irritant. So Semmelweis was unable to find a job in Vienna, so he moved 135 miles down the Danube River. Some of you have done that cruise, to Budapest. It was his hometown. There was another hospital that had a high rate of labor fever. So he brought back the wash basins and the death rate plummeted. He wrote a 543-page book about his research and his results, but his colleagues were jealous and ridiculed him and would not even read his book. So, haunted by the death of these new mothers, finally his sanity broke. He died in a mental institution, ironically of blood poisoning. In Numbers 19, 11 through 12, let me have someone read that top part of that.
The person who touches any human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. He is to purify himself with the water of purification, mixed with ashes, see the discussion later, on the 3rd day and the 7th day. Then he will be clean.
So we're going to talk some more about this, but first of all, they wanted to avoid leaving home and job for a week, and they didn't want to be called unclean, so they avoided contact with the dead. Well, for Israel, that ended the Egyptian practice of embalming the dead, because they did all that. That was very gory and everything. It was all hands-on, no gloves, of course. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help the wounded man who had been attacked by robbers. The religious Jews passed him by for fear he was dead. It's not like, well, maybe we can help this guy, or he looks too far gone. If he was a dead person, then it would make them unclean. So that's the main reason they passed him by. In Leviticus 12, God declared new mothers to be off limits for their husbands or unclean for an entire week. I imagine it had to come from God, because the woman didn't have much rights and her husband did. So no one was allowed to touch her, and the penalty for accidentally touching her was to bathe, wash clothes, remain separate until sundown. And this practice is not from a low view of women in a male-dominated society. It was, but that's not the reason for this practice. It was from God's high view of mothers and motherhood. The new mother was left alone to devote her attention to her newborn baby. What an excellent way to promote bonding. After birthing a male child, her purification ritual was 7 days plus 33, so 40 days. After birthing a female child, mom was unclean for 14 days and then 66 days more to complete her purification, a total of 80. You're going, wait a minute, is that fair? Her discharge of blood postpartum was the cause for her ritual uncleanness. The doubling of the time for purification may be because her female newborn was a future mother. Wiersbe says, perhaps God established these regulations primarily for the health of the mother and her bonding to her daughter, because the social structure of Israel was so decidedly masculine. Sons were more welcome than daughters, and this was this made this daughter special, because mom got to be off of kitchen duty for 80 days. Okay. Let's talk about ashes in the Bible. Numbers 19, 2 through 19, we're not going to read all that, describes the rite of the red heifer for ritual purification. A red cow, you hear a lot of discussion about the red heifer in Israel in modern times and the return of the red heifer. So this is where that's coming from. The red cow was sacrificed as a ritual for purification. The red cow was taken outside the camp by the priest, slaughtered by him. Its blood was collected and then taken into the camp and sprinkled toward the front of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. But the whole cow was burned on a wood fire outside the camp with cedar wood that's red and hyssop and red yarn. So a lot of symbolism in all this. The ashes from this fire were collected in jars and kept for use later. The ashes would then be mixed with clean water and used to remove impurity from a person, a corpse, or a tent where someone died. The ashes and water are sprinkled with a branch of hyssop on everything to be purified.
Or did the ashes create like an acetic thing that would kill bacteria?
We're going to kind of hint at that, but yeah, there was definitely some medical, not thought, but God had a plan to use some of that science.
Well, that's what we use for our detergent.
Ashes.
Yeah, ashes of a red heifer.
Well,
It's getting hard to
You're
find
clean.
those red heads.
Yeah, every Saturday is brutal.
yeah, well, you can burn it outside the camp. So I mean, you can do it in your backyard. So,
What is
His neighbors
hyssop?
love him.
What is hyssop?
hyssop is a plant that's stalky, and it basically, with the thing about hyssop is you can dip it in liquid, and you can, kind of like a sponge, you can fling it and throw it. And so you remember the Passover in Egypt, we'll come back to that, but basically hyssop was something they could dip in the blood and throw it against the lintels and the doorposts to mark the house, so that the destroyer, God's angel, would pass over that house.
Okay.
And we're going to talk more about hyssop here. So we're going to compare modern hospital hand washing with Numbers 19, 2 through 8. The unblemished red cow was slaughtered by the priest outside the camp, then burned there. Ashes were gathered, kept for use to remove impurity. Verse 17 and 19, ashes plus clean water were used for purifying the unclean. So that's just a rehash of what I said. 4 things. First of all, running water in the hospital when we wash our hands. We don't dip them in a stagnant bowl of water. We have running water, and that's to rinse off germs. And in the Bible, the water was showered from the hyssop branch, so it's essentially running water. They're taking this and washing things off with it. It's kind of like the original kitchen sprayer, So, second, you need time to assure a thorough job. So, you know how doctors are about hand washing. We've already established that. So they talk about a legitimate surgical scrub is so many minutes, and you see them in the movies, they always shorten it a little bit, and for Hollywood's sake. So in the Bible, the time washing was repeated over 7 days. It's one of the reasons why it took 7 days to become clean, was that you had to wash and then expose to sunlight to kill the germs, and wash again and more sunlight. And so it was over a period of 7 days, drying in sunshine, killing the germs. Third, we use antiseptic soap to kill germs. Hyssop contains the antiseptic thymol. It's an active ingredient in Listerine. Not trying to discourage you from using Listerine. So, and then vigorous scrubbing is to dislodge germs from the crevices And you can see them vigorously scrubbing, and someone else, I guess, is using the hyssop like the kitchen sprayer and getting plenty of water running over them. In the Bible, the soap that they use contains cedar oil, and the main reason for putting the cedar oil in there is that it was a skin irritant, so it made you work harder to get it off. And that's maybe why doctors don't like to wash their hands. All that irritant in there. So not really. Most of the modern soaps have, all kinds of lotions and things. So they're trying to encourage scrubbing, and they also put wool fibers and ashes. Are we starting to sound more like lava soap now? Yeah. You can make up your own concoction at home.
Is that an abrasive to kill the bacteria and viruses? Or?
It's more to break them loose. Yeah, you're encouraging scrubbing, and you're trying to break up whatever, all the gunk that's on your hands.
Now, lava soap is used by mechanics a lot of times because it gets the grease stains out of the skin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing with orange, yeah.
Yeah. Hummus.
What's the orange one that you see in the
Fast
mechanics
orange.
use?
Gojo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Exodus 12, Moses commanded Israel to prepare in Egypt for the death angel, the destroyer, to pass over the homes that had the blood of the Passover lamb splashed on the lintel and doorpost by a cluster of hyssop. While Jesus hung on the cross, he said, "I'm thirsty." What did they do? They took a sponge full of sour wine, placed it on a hyssop branch, and offered him that to drink. We could get into more of the symbolism of that. But so hyssop is also used typically in gargles, medicinal baths, creams for skin irritation, burns, frostbite. Starting to sound like snake oil. It's used for everything. It's used for digestive and intestinal problems, including liver and gallbladder conditions, intestinal pain, gas, and colic. It'll fix everything. Okay. Psalm 51:7. I don't have any stock in hyssop. So. Psalm says, "Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." In verse 11, "Do not banish me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me." And Jesus was probably meditating on this verse while he was on the cross, because he knew the scripture. Hebrews 9:11-14, the author combines the ritual of the ashes of the red cow and that of the Day of Atonement. That was the once a year Day of Atonement, and demonstrating the once and for all sufficiency of the blood of Christ in cleansing us from all of our sins. Someone read that for me. The bottom half there.
In the greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, he entered the most holy place once for all time, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption.
Okay. Leviticus 4:12 describes how the bull that was used for a sin offering was slaughtered at the tent of meeting, at the tabernacle. Its blood was sprinkled in the tent. Its fatty organs were burned on the altar of burnt sacrifice. And that fire was kept going all the time. But when the sacrifice was put on there, then that fire was kept going, kept burning all night. They took the rest of the bull outside the camp and burned it on a wood fire at the ash heap. The next morning, the priest puts on his special linen robe and undergarments just to remove the ashes. This is back at the tabernacle at the altar of burnt offering. And he's going to remove the ashes, put them in a special container, go back in, change clothes again, because he couldn't take those special garments outside of the temple area. Then he would take the ashes out of the camp to a ceremonially clean place. Probably the same place where the red heifer was burned. So, as I thought through this, I thought, they're in the desert. How do they get all the firewood? But anyway, that's just a thought. I'm sure God provided. They weren't cutting down huge trees. They probably had lots of smaller trees. So in the Bible, ashes symbolize mourning, repentance, mortality, and penance. And they're also a sign of redemption through Christ's sacrifice. So let's talk about hand washing for surgery. During most of the 19th century, patients and doctors prepared for surgery very casually. There was no sterilizing of instruments or careful washing of hands. You wouldn't put up with that now, but anyway. Medical students were encouraged to put their germ-covered hands into the open wound and feel around and, learn the anatomy that way. In 1876, Dr. Roswell Park, who became a famous surgeon, he was a hospital intern who noted that with few exceptions, every patient operated on died of blood poisoning or sepsis. That was 29 years after Semmelweis's discoveries. But you remember Semmelweis, he made these great discoveries, but his colleagues just said, no, we're not even listening to that. Simple hand washing would have prevented many deaths. In fact, in World War II, some of the hospitals would run out of rubber gloves, and so the surgeons would carefully wash their hands and operated with bare hands. They were surprised that infection rates did not rise. More recently, Boston City Hospital Nursery had an outbreak of a bacterial staph infection. 11 newborns caught this and 4 died. This was early in my training, learning about this. A careful investigation found the culprit was one nurse who just didn't wash her hands adequately. 4 babies died. When I was at Parkland Hospital, we were delivering like 19,000 babies a year. A lot of babies.
You did that.
I personally didn't deliver all of those. I did some deliveries. I'll never forget that 13-pounder. Anyway, so they came out slippery too. But we divided the hospital nursery into rooms that could hold 10 babies, 10 bassinets, 10. There might be 100 babies in there, 10 little rooms. The nurses most of them had 10 fingers. They would come in and wash a different finger for each baby to touch their nose to decide if they needed a bilirubin test. I mean, it was just kind of this followed the Boston epidemic. The babies were cohorted, so if there was an outbreak, the theory was, okay, we could limit it to this little room. And I just threw that slide in so that you would know it wasn't always the doctor's poor hand washing.
Just
every now and then it's a nurse.
It's mostly.
All right, so we're going to switch subjects a bit. We're going to talk about public sanitation and sewage disposal. Doesn't sound very exciting, but it does have a good lesson from the Bible. So in the 1800s, again, it was a rough time before we really understood germ theory. There were epidemics of cholera. Cholera causes rapid dehydration from severe diarrhea. And even in the day of having IVs, it's hard to keep up with the amount of fluid that they're losing. And so they would rapidly dehydrate and die. This was raging in the 1840s, started in Afghanistan, came through Europe. England saw it coming. Parliament turned to Edwin Chadwick on the Board of Health. He was a guy who did all these extensive studies. For 14 years, he studied and found that the rich man in England could expect to live 43 years and a poor Englishman only 22 years. And he concluded the poor were dying from a lack of sanitation. In 1 year during the cholera epidemic, there was a courtyard serving 12 houses. 63 people died in 1 year living in that courtyard. Well, there were 2 cesspools, that's a septic system that's open, in the courtyard. And unfortunately, they were below the level of the sewer, so they weren't draining. So these people are living in their own sewage. And there was one water well in the middle of the courtyard, and it, of course, was contaminated. They would have to run and run and run trying to get it clear enough to drink something from it. The sewers at the time were large with flat bottoms, and there was rarely enough water flowing to actually flush what was in the sewers downstream. So every 5 to 10 years, they would dig up the streets and climb down with buckets and take buckets of solid sewage up, load them on wagons, take them out in the country and put them on farmland, on the crops. And then when the crops were harvested, they would bring them back into the city to sell to the people.
Healthy food.
You're going, wow, you really did that?
It was organic.
Okay, makes you wonder. All right. Anyway, so, enough of that. So, the rich people lived in homes with running water, toilets, garbage service, but they blamed the poor people for laziness, neglecting their hygiene, drinking too much alcohol, avoiding doctors, which the rich could afford, but anyway, and crowding together. So Chadwick's disagreeing. He says, who would choose to live, work, and sleep in their own sewage? They're constantly sick, they died young, they left orphan children. His solution was that every house could receive running water, a flush toilet, a draining sewer, and garbage collection for pennies. So cholera hit about 1848. This wasn't the first, but this was the worst cholera epidemic. And it began to climb the social ladder. Normally the rich could hide in their big homes and avoid stuff like that, but it began to climb the social ladder because it was so contagious. Those in power had ignored Chadwick, who, unfortunately, he noted that the London sewers flowed into the Thames River above the drinking water source. I know, it's a real head shaker. So he made efforts. So any efforts to flush out the sewers, what was that doing? That was flushing the cholera right into the drinking water. So Parliament had ignored his efforts to reroute the sewers. He was trying to reroute the sewers to clean up the drinking water, but they had ignored that also. The London epidemic raged for a full year. In the previous epidemic, only 16,000 died, and this time over 72,000 died. Chadwick had a long list of enemies. The welfare department, because he exposed their neglect of thousands of orphans. The Treasury Department, because he hired extra doctors without waiting for Treasury approval. You can imagine how long it would have taken for Treasury approval. The landlords, who objected to his socialism, and Parliament, who were elected only by landowners, and they were tired of hearing about the sewage of the non-voting poor. So Chadwick wanted to prevent the next epidemic. He says, okay, that was a big hit, big loss, so we're going to try to prevent this. He found that a 4-inch pipe, I know this sounds familiar because today we have 4-inch pipes carrying our sewage. He found that a 4-inch pipe could easily drain the sewage from more than 1,000 people. After a year-long survey, he began installing a completely new system. And by 1853, 4-inch pipes were draining more than 27,000 London homes. And the death rates in those areas were cut by half, just by having better sewage control. Here's an ancient answer. In Deuteronomy 23, 12 through 13, Israel was told to have a place outside the camp to go to relieve yourself. I thought about the logistics of that. You got 1 million people anyway. Everybody's got a shovel, but you have to have a tool to dig a hole and cover up the excrement. There's a modern backpacking guide that recommends go at least 100 yards from water supply, trail, and camp. Dig a hole at least 4 inches deep and cover the results. Sounds very biblical. The biblical method separates human waste from human beings. Okay, now we're going to shift gears.
Okay, before you do,
Yes.
just want to let you all know that we have to run a campaign. And we're not just kidding, but we have, because the same problem you're talking about, sewage is too high. When this property was developed for our church, it's not connected to the city sewage system. We have to lift our garbage up into a sewer.
So there's a lift station.
We have a lift station. not surprisingly, craps out every once in a while.
Literally.
We're in that situation right now, so we had to approve a new lift station for the church this week.
Wow.
Very pertinent.
I'm sure those are cheap, right?
And we couldn't go out front to put it in.
We gave everyone a shovel.
I'm
Go past the cemetery.
gonna suggest that you're gonna lead that effort, so.
There's
If
a
we all came in
line
with
from
hand
the
trowels, they would
Catholic
think we're
Church.
all pro
We should
gardening.
be able to go to that.
Apparently not.
So I also, on the Thames River, even though they've rerouted it in London, they still don't,
It's still pretty nasty.
yeah. They still
Don't wanna go
get into-
swimming in the Thames.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so another topic here, also related to London in that time, is, the author calls this the cemetery plot. The treatment of the dead in London was even worse than the living. A funeral would cost 20 weeks' wages, so a family might struggle for 10 or more days to raise the money
Oh, my
while the corpse is rotting in their home. I won't get any more gruesome than that, but
Oh,
a lot of people, they had a one-room house, and here's this corpse right in the middle of it. Drip, drip, drip. But anyway, if the person had died of typhus, the typhus-carrying lice would leave the cold body and feed on the warm bodies in the room, and soon the whole family might be dead. At the cemetery, each vertical grave might hold 8 adults and 20 to 30 children with a thin layer of dirt on top. 200 cemeteries in London. You can imagine how it smelled. All that rotting flesh, not covered very well. So Chadwick's solution was simple: prohibit all burials in the city limits. Not politically correct, but anyway, prohibit all burials in the city limits. Large fields outside of London would make spacious cemeteries. Bodies could be quickly moved to mortuaries, stored 3 days, and then taken by barge up the Thames to the cemeteries. The money saved by the poor might amount to 30% of their savings. Of course, Parliament didn't care about the poor. Church grounds could become playgrounds, but the parish priest would lose the burial fees, so that wasn't tenable. And undertakers were furious because there were 3,000 of them fighting for an average of 114 weekly funerals. So, a lot of competitive pressure. Most of them, however, could have found work in his new system with new mortuaries, cemeteries, and everything. In the end, Chadwick's plans would simply not be tried. By 1854, Parliament was fed up with his embarrassing reports, so they dissolved the Board of Health, forced him to retire, and for most of his 36 years of forced retirement, he was widely vilified and denounced. Months before his death, a newspaper gave him some credit. Had he killed in battle as many as he saved by sanitation, he would have had equestrian statues by the dozen put up in his memory. Deuteronomy 21, 22 through 23, God directed Israel to not leave even executed criminals unburied. Even murderers were not to be left hanging for days, but should be buried the same day before dusk. Jesus, after the worst type of death, was buried the same day. His friend Lazarus was buried quickly after he died. In fact, Martha was horrified when Jesus wanted to open the tomb after 4 days. When buried promptly, the corpse took its germs to the grave with it. Completely new subject. And this is just
It's a bonus.
a little brief mention. See how the Bible deals with this. Alcoholism. In the past, driving while impaired by alcohol was seen as a normal part of American life. Just, oh, Joe, but of course we have faster cars now, but now it's treated as a crime against society and our children. Many violent crimes, murders, rapes, assaults, robberies, suicides are committed by impaired people. Alcohol poisons every organ of the body, and causes many diseases. Fetal alcohol syndrome, which I had to deal with, leads to withdrawal symptoms in newborns. mental retardation, and incoordination. Alcohol use in adults can lower testosterone levels and impair sexual function. It can destroy families. It costs American society hundreds of billions of dollars per year. 10% of health insurance, 40% of auto insurance premiums. And alcohol abuse costs society more than every cancer and every lung disease total. So what does the Bible say? Ephesians 5:17 says, so don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is, and don't get drunk with wine, which leads to reckless living, but be filled by the Spirit. And obviously I'm talking about alcohol abuse. Proverbs 23, listen, my son, and be wise. Keep your mind on the right course. Don't associate with those who drink too much wine or with those who gorge themselves on meat. I love that they're putting the drunkard and the glutton together. Both will become poor. Grogginess will clothe them in rags. Who has woe? Who has sorrows? Who has conflicts? Wounds for no reason, red eyes. In the end, it bites like a snake. Even the medical community has realized that a purely medical approach to alcoholism is next to worthless. Alcoholics Anonymous has had an amazing results by stressing the basics of Christianity. Unfortunately, in more recent years, AA has strayed from that Christian base and become less effective. But it was dramatically effective for a time. Tobacco smoking. In 1912, a medical text called lung cancer the rarest of diseases. Today, lung cancer is America's #1 cancer killer. In 2024, 125,000 plus people were expected to die from lung cancer, the cause of 1 in 5 cancer deaths. The average age of diagnosis is 70 years. We're living longer now, so more time for that to show up. However, the number of new lung cancer cases and deaths is decreasing due to smoking cessation and advances in treatment. But cigarette smoke contains more than 40 cancer-causing chemicals. From 1900, this is the "you come a long way, baby" thing. From 1900 to 1999, the percent of women who smoked increased from 6% to 22%. Lung cancer deaths in women increased 400%, just from 1960 to 1999, and surpassing breast cancer as the #1 killer of women with cancer. Emphysema follows when smoking causes breakdown of the elastin suspension system, which keeps the tiny air tubes open. Smoking causes narrowed arteries and stickier blood platelets. The thickened blood tends to clot in narrowed coronary arteries, leading to a heart attack. Compared to non-smokers, the smoker's heart attack is more severe. Carbon monoxide has depleted oxygen from his blood, but his nicotine-stimulated heart needs even more oxygen. The smoker's heart attack kills more heart cells and is more likely to kill him. Children of smokers have more ear infections and respiratory problems. Smoking during pregnancy causes shorter, sicker, and lower IQ babies. If mom had a secondhand smoke exposure, like if dad smoked, the infant's risk of sudden infant death syndrome is doubled. And if mom smoked during the pregnancy, the SIDS risk is tripled. Over 80% of smokers start before their 16th birthday. They want to feel more mature. Parental attitudes, the "don't do that," does not influence teen smokers, but parental examples do. So a smoking parent doubles the chance the child will smoke. Nicotine withdrawal symptoms of anxiety and irritation are relieved about 7 seconds after inhaling. A puff, in 7 seconds, you're getting relief. Interestingly, stress acidifies the urine and speeds up nicotine excretion. So when you're stressed, you have to smoke more to maintain the same nicotine blood levels. Nicotine is highly addictive, but using nicotine patches, gum, and there's even a nasal spray and other medications, doctors can now help many people quit who failed before. Increasing the cost of cigarettes by taxing them more and forcing big tobacco to pay large fines, which increases the cost of the cigarettes. Banning tobacco advertisement helps reduce smoking.
Well, I can tell you, Tom, it's not cool, at least in the States, it's just not cool anymore. Now it's vaping, that's a whole different
Right.
issue, but cigarettes
Right.
just aren't cool anymore.
And this is part of the reason why, the lung cancer and
Oh,
emphysema.
absolutely.
So, what does the Bible say? Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You're not your own, for you were bought at a price. So glorify God with your body, 1 Corinthians 6. And whatever you're doing, do it all for the glory of God, 1 Corinthians 10. Okay, this is the last topic. Everything else has been kind of history. This is what we've done. This is what we've learned from the Bible. Circumcision is interesting to me, dear to my heart. I've done almost 2,000 circumcisions in 40 years of practice. But this is not intended to shame anybody for circumcising or not circumcising. But let's just look at what I've got here. Circumcision opponents have grown more vocal since the 1960s. I entered practice in 1981. Claiming it is child abuse and torture that causes long-lasting psychological damage to the child.
Really?
The author was not able to find any men who were enraged about being circumcised without their consent. A few vocal critics call it genital mutilation. By 1971, the American Academy of Pediatrics, kind of influenced by all of this, it issued an emphatic statement saying there are no valid medical indications for newborn circumcision. By the early 1980s, medical professors tended to agree. Love this guy's name, Dr. Thomas Wiswell. He joined the group against circumcision, but he was hospital-based, and one day he was reviewing hospital records of 200,000 newborn boys, and he noticed a startling trend. Uncircumcised boys were 10 times more likely to suffer UTI, urinary tract infection. And as the number of uncircumcised infants doubled, the rate of serious UTI doubled. Because they had no plausible explanation, many dismissed his findings. He continued his research. More than 9 different studies found circumcision to protect against UTI. Now during this time, I know we don't live in Africa, but during this time, the AIDS epidemic hit Africa, infecting millions. 90% through heterosexual contact. Up to 80% of African prostitutes were infected. 10% of Ugandan children were orphaned. In 1988, scientists observed that uncircumcised men were up to 8 times more likely to become infected with AIDS. And AIDS spreads mostly among tribes that do not practice circumcision. Where circumcision is common, AIDS is rare. So when you look at it, and I didn't know this until I read this book and started researching. You look at a map of Africa, there are pockets of circumcision all over the continent. And so they had these tribal groups that were pretty uniform in their customs, and they could just say, okay, circumcision is popular, a whole lot less AIDS. Now I realize we're not living in Africa, but this is not surprising to those that are aware that almost 50 studies have found the moist, thin foreskin is much more susceptible to all kinds of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Now circumcision and condoms are considered the best protection against AIDS. But God's command to keep sex within marriage protects against AIDS and other STDs. Circumcision does dramatically reduce the number of AIDS carriers.
In those places where it was less, was there a religious element because of the circumcision, or was that just something they were doing?
It may have been.
They might have had a conscience then about,
Some of them might have been Muslim, because in Islam, circumcision is practiced. Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Some of them may have been Christians. and that may be why they did it. So, prevention of cancer, so it's shifting gears just a little bit. Prevention of cancer has long been known. There was a study in 1932 that showed that circumcision protects against penile cancer. Of 1,100 plus such cancers, not a single case occurred in a Jewish man. 0. God commanded circumcision almost 4,000 years ago. Of 521 men with penile cancer, none were circumcised. 0. So, interesting. So by 1989, the American Academy of Pediatrics revised their statement in favor of circumcision that the benefits outweigh the risk. However, it's kind of hard to get over the fact that you've advocated against it for so long. So a recent AAP statement says, though the health benefits outweigh the risk, the benefits are not great enough to recommend it across the board. Sound like a bunch of doctors? Okay. Let's talk about the pain of circumcision. It's definitely remembered by boys who undergo it when they're older. Okay? Remember right before Israel went into the promised land after 40 years of wandering? And I don't fully understand why. That maybe it was just dry climate, whatever. They didn't circumcise any of their boys for 40 years. So you had a bunch of fighting men age ready to go into the land, and they circumcised all of them. All of them at one time. That would have been quite a scene. And then they were kind of laid up for probably at least a week. Maybe it had something to do with that unclean thing, but
And pain, I'm thinking pain.
I'm thinking pain. So I did circumcisions for 40 years. In 1981, we were not injecting an anesthetic because the babies tolerated it extremely well. With the procedures very quick, and they had minimal crying, and I'm like, are you hungry or are you hurting? Because as soon as we got through and they went to eat, because they had to have an empty stomach, so we did all these babies hungry. I'm not saying there was no pain. I'm just saying that it didn't seem to be a big issue. Well, when we started using, the reason we didn't do the injection earlier is because we thought, first do no harm. We thought we could inject it in the wrong place, we could cause a problem, make the penis necrose and fall off. I mean, there was all kinds of issues. The injection is done right under the skin on both sides because there's dorsal penile nerves there. We don't have any kids in here, so I'm just gonna say it. You guys, nothing you don't hear on Netflix probably. So before I began using a local anesthetic, the babies didn't cry very much. Afterwards, the procedure was basically painless. You could say the injection caused little pain, but it quickly went away. And when the medicine wore off, they were not very irritable. They didn't act like, oh, what did you do to me? But these were newborns. And my own personal choice was not to do this on a baby over 2 weeks of age. I might have pushed that a little bit on a baby whose parents really wanted it and who was preterm or something, was sick initially and couldn't have it done. By the age of 3 months, I'm told, I didn't do any 3-month-olds, the pain and irritability lasts 3 to 4 days. Not surprising. Okay, a small percentage of uncircumcised boys will need it done later because of a medical problem, phimosis, where the foreskin tightens and can't be retracted easily. Actually, my granddad was very weak and debilitated and had a couple of heart attacks, and then in his feeble state, he started getting UTIs, and because he had some phimosis, he had to have a circumcision, and I think he was in his 80s.
Just like Abraham.
So, the most humane time for circumcision is when he is a newborn. Let's talk about the timing. Babies need vitamin K to make blood clotting proteins, prothrombin. So the newborns have to, how do they get vitamin K? They have to ingest food, populate their gut with beneficial bacteria, usually it's from breastfeeding, to make the vitamin K. And by day 3 of life, his prothrombin level has dropped to 30 to 40% of normal. But by day 8, it's 110% of normal. So if you look at the prothrombin levels, it goes down, 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 up, 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 and there's this peak at 8 days of age. So you think God knew what he was doing when he said do it on the 8th day?
Amen.
Now, why is that not relevant today? And so I've had some families, some very godly families, who said, we really want it done on the 8th day. I'm like, okay, we can do that. Let me explain to you why that's, God doesn't necessarily want us to do it that way now. So now we inject vitamin K in the delivery room. We do their eyes and thighs. Talk about the neonatal nurses. Did you do their eyes and thighs? So what we're doing is hastening the production of prothrombin, and that helps protect against the most dangerous bleeding, which would be a brain bleed, which can be caused, if you don't have vitamin K, can be caused by even mild birth trauma. And one more little tidbit, Genesis 17:12, God told Abraham to circumcise every boy on the 8th day. And Joshua 5:2, he said to use a new flint knife. You break the flint and you make the new, sharp, clean, more or less sterile blade, and less chance of infection. What time is it? Okay. I don't want to stir up controversy. I just want to leave it that, it's something in our modern day culture, people choose not to do circumcision. I sat down and wrote a list of pros and cons. I'll just lay that on you real quick and show you that I am trying to see both sides of it.
I think you're out of time though, until.
Do I need to stop now?
They're already waiting.
They're
They're ready. Okay, so thank you. I hope that you got a sense of the history.
That was great.
Very good.